Alright. NET-113, IT Essentials, starting Chapter 3, and it is 9/22/16. So, what we did today, we did an overview, then we took a practice test. After the students got done with the practice test, they started looking at the labs, and then I covered some topics, and then the rest of the time they had to work on the labs. And I told them, want to work together, they can, or they can work individually. So in the overview, we started out and we talked about what were the key items when it comes to Chapter 3, talking about the motherboard, processor, and all that stuff. So we got started, and the students mentioned the processor and how it communicates or attaches to the motherboard. So we have this communication link here, and then later on we talked about some specifics of that. The next most important thing we thought was memory. In memory, inline, those dual inline modules, we talked about how memory is connected to the motherboard. So we get this here, and then eventually we started talking about communications between processor and memory. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Then the students mentioned storage. I actually mentioned a hard drive, and we plugged those into the motherboard, SATA or whatever way we're doing that. So that too is attached. Then we mentioned ports. They can be built into the motherboard, or we could have a slot, and we could add some card into the device to also connect to the motherboard. And we talked about one of the key things that hooks this all together is the bus. Some type of bus. So we can have the ports. We get this communication, get the communication between memory and storage, communication between the processor and memory, and so forth. And then we even talked about some of the outside things connecting in the ports. Keyboard, mouse, all those things. Okay? And then one last key item. We talked about clocking. We talked about hertz, megahertz, gigahertz is what we measure now. Billions of cycles per second. So as information moves through here, it's done by some timing, how many clock cycles it takes to get something from here to here. So later on we'll talk about, but how that synchronization of those together. Okay? That makes sense? Cross that out. Alright, let's move on to the next page. And then we talked about from this whole thing, we can talk about some type of performance of the computer, factor all those factors that we just talked about over there. Memory, processor, storage, connection between them all. We talk about getting things done. We talk about throughput. You know, you have from when you maybe introduce the data to when you get the information. Data transformed into information. You know, in old term they used to measure millions of instructions per second, MIPS. But you don't hear much of that anymore today. At least I don't. To make that all work, we're talking about all those pieces of hardware and moving that stuff through the bus in the hardware. Well, communicating with the hardware, is this whole idea of system software. We talk about firmware, the BIOS, and the UEFI. Okay, we talked about just briefly about those. We're moving from BIOS to UEFI. I mentioned how the operating system communicates with the hardware, the apps communicate with an operating system, and the user communicates typically with the app, but in some cases the operating system, or maybe even directly the hardware. So we reviewed that idea. The students then took the practice test, and then we started working on the labs, and then we came back and we talked about some key things for the motherboard. We talked about form factors. You know, there's more than that, but we just listed that. Then we talked about the processor sockets, and we mentioned a couple of the key ones: pin grid array or land grid array, PGA or LGA. And there's other ones. We didn't cover them all on the board. So what form factor, and then place the socket, put the processor, and then a chipset. And that's going to control memory, the buses, and some peripherals. Basically 2 companies make these chipsets. And then that's where we start talking about the North Bridge and South Bridge, a few other things. Up with, we mentioned we also have buses and expansion slots. So, key things may seem simple, but somehow things move from memory to the processor and back to memory along some bus. You can put an expansion slot in, and maybe there have a video card that manages the video out to the monitor. So we're going to take all this and start talking about details in the next session. And that's it.